Welcome back, KRON 4 News Weekend. Boy, I just found out something about our guest. It's hard to believe. It has nothing to do with the subject, but ladies and gentlemen, Eric Maisel doesn't even own a cell phone, ladies and gentlemen.
Trying to be the last person in the world without a cell phone.
Well, not only is he one of the most unusual people in the world, truly unique, but he is the author of a book called The Van Gogh Blues, The Creative Person's Path Through Depression. And the gist of this is that people who are creative do have a tendency, as we know, in many, many cases, to be little nuts, okay? So why is that, first of all?
Well, I think we're talking specifically about depression.
Well, I'm just kidding, but yes.
And I think they tend to be depressed because it's existential depression they're suffering from. Namely, they decide that they want to hold meaning afloat for the world. They want to be the cultural witnesses, the cultural actors. And so because they want to keep meaning afloat, when they have difficulty doing that, and all of us as creative people do have difficulty doing that, then the meaning seems to drain out of their lives, and the depression they experience is this existential depression. So I think 100% of creative people are going to experience this kind of depression at least sometimes in their life.
Well, but they've created something, and sometimes, I mean, I can understand when you do something and it's like, oh man, I just wasted a lot of time, it stinks. But it doesn't apply to whether it's good or bad. Some of the most depressed people are successful.
But the dirty little secret is if you spend 3 years writing a novel, you may end up with a successful novel. And at that split second, you may feel like you've done something meaningful. But for those 1,000 days, virtually 700 or 800 of those days, you're just slogging along, struggling, not really believing in your novel, because here you are faced with a bad paragraph that you're trying to revise.
Right.
So most of the time, you're not experiencing life as successful or meaningful, even though you know that down the road, you will have done something that's meaningful. And that's one of the tricks. That's one of the tricks in maintaining meaning, is reminding yourself that even though today is hard, you're working towards something that you're going to experience as meaningful.
But Van Gogh was successful, and at this point, although he never quite acknowledged it, and he was jealous of others, and you know,
well, he was successful at painting, but not successful at keeping meaning afloat.
Right. So I mean, he and GOGH were having these problems, but so he went into a terrible depression, even though this was
that was his second depression. His first depression, he was a pastor first, and he was too vehement as a pastor, and he was fired. So he tried to make meaning as a religious person first, was fired, had a meaning crisis then, almost committed suicide, then tried to make it by painting to sustain meaning, couldn't do it there. The secret is we need relationships as well as our creative art. That's the headline here.
Okay, so now that we've stated the problem, let's go ahead and talk about how a creative person can deal with that very problem. You've created something, you're feeling lousy about it. Where do you start?
Well, for one thing, since we're talking about existential depression, we have to not forget that depression might be something else, like biological depression. So if you're deeply blue, you need a medical workup. You need to make sure that we're talking about the same depression.
So, well, excuse me, but most doctors these days, your average doctor, I doubt, can tell the difference. But that...
Absolutely, but you're going to the doctor to see if maybe antidepressants are going to help you. Because if you're severely depressed, you sort of don't want to stubbornly not check in to the medical community to see if that might. But let's say you've done all of that. Let's say you've done the home remedies like exercise and sunlight and all the other things we know help with depression. Then I think you want to look at the existential depression issue. And the starting place there is to remind yourself that you matter and that your efforts matter to you. Because I think that's the piece of negative self-talk that's going on in a creative person's mind day in and day out. They're telling themselves, I'm not that talented, it doesn't matter that much whether this poem gets published, etc., etc. They're talking themselves into the crisis. So you want to get a grip on your mind, as the Buddha said. You want to get a grip on your mind and say new things to yourself, say different things to yourself that remind you that you are able to make meaning in your life.
We have 40 seconds for you to explain the concept that you want people to find versus to make versus find meaning.
Yeah, I think we've had a metaphor for a long time of seeking meaning and finding meaning, and a lot of people need to go out looking for meaning, and I think it's time we stop thinking that way and had a paradigm shift toward making meaning, that we know enough already, we know what our principles are, we know what our work is, and we should just assert that we're going to make meaning rather than talk ourselves into the position that we're going to have to find meaning somewhere out there in the world.
So Eric Maisel is going to be appearing on Friday, 7 p.m. at Book Passage, Tamla Vista Boulevard in Corte Madera, 415-927-0960, bookpassage.com, and the book is called The Van Gogh Blues. We've been discussing, do we say
the Van Gogh Blues?
Van Gogh, you say Van Gogh, and I say Van Gogh, and Marty and Isabel say it any way they like.
Say it's time to go.
Or it's time to golf.